Oh, excellent. So hello, everyone. We are now recording. I would like to thank Joanna Malinowska for being here for our second official EPIME Journal Club. So Dr. Joanna is a professor at philosophy at, forgive me, I'm going to massacre this name.
Adam Mickiewicz University.
Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland.
Yeah.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong, your specialization is in the philosophy of science, specifically looking at racialization and racial categories in medical and biomedical research.
Generally, yes. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to have this talk today, and I'm very excited about our discussions later. I will try not to be too philosophical, so I will try to talk about the problem of using ethnoracial categories in science generally, but particularly in biomedical research in regard to practice and in regard to more like specific situations, not only about very abstract philosophical problems. So I will start with a short introduction of the whole problem of using ethnoracial categories in biomedical research and healthcare. Then I will present my proposition of conceptualization of racialization when it comes to individuals that could be used in biomedical research and healthcare. And then I would like to invite you to discussion in context of a few problems that I will present. So what's the deal with the ethnoracial categories and their use in biomedical research and generally in medicine? So this is where I should tell you the story why I was interested in this issue. So a few years ago, my mother had some kind of health problem. Something just grew on her jawbone, and no one could actually diagnose her. Like first, some surgeons said that probably she has a cancer, and this thing looks very seriously. Then she had some kind of biopsy, and again they couldn't recognize what's happening. So my mother thought she's dying of cancer for about 3 months, as long as one of her doctors sent her medical file to international conference. And no one at that conference knew that she is Polish woman in her late 50s or early 60s, and that she looks like almost every other Polish woman. So her skin is pretty white. Especially that in medical documentation in Poland, no one is putting information about so-called race. So she was incognito, I would say. And just after a few minutes, someone said, okay, this is not a very serious health issue. This is just some kind of condition that is very specific to Asians. So as long as my mother stayed white, she couldn't get her diagnosis. And when someone forgot, like when others didn't know what is her race, just by looking on the scans, they said, it's not a problem. It is just this Asian thing, right? So as I said before, sometimes medical practitioners in my country, just because it appears to be very homogeneous, they ignore the fact that there are some kind of conditions that are usually related or recognized as non-white conditions or conditions of non-white people, and they don't want to learn about it because they have this belief that probably they won't be able to use that knowledge here in Poland because, you know, we don't have many people who are different than us. Of course, this is a very stereotypical way of thinking about the problem, but it's make me think about it, especially that few months later, I had a head scan, and the surgeon who saw it said, "Oh my God, you have a very mongoloid skull." And so, like, what? What does it really mean? Like, I have a mongoloid skull. So apparently there are some kind of, like, you know, that those shapes here that Asian women have on their skulls, and Caucasians, they don't have it usually. But as my mother, who had some kind of Asian condition, I also probably have some Asian genes. And this is not very surprising because a lot of Poles have them, as we are very mixed population in the end. So I was thinking, okay, so what does it really mean to use those categories in science? And a few years later, when pandemic started, we saw all of those titles in the journals. There are racial differences in deaths of COVID. There are racial differences in the transmission of COVID. Maybe we should try to find different treatments for members of different populations, and usually they call those populations as races. Then there are some kind of genes responsible for different COVID outcomes in different ethnoracial groups. So even though in few months, many scientists criticized that kind of biological perspective on those differences, there were those articles saying that this is not race, but racial injustice or racism that is causing the differences in death tolls or differences in transmission of COVID, just because some kind of populations or representatives of some populations are living in worse conditions. Health is just worse, or they have worse access to healthcare, etc. So this is not a matter of race, but this is a matter of racism. Yet that kind of titles continue to appear. And just a year or two ago, I put it those few words, racial differences into Google or Google Scholar, and there are like tons of different medical titles of articles about racial differences. And this is funny because most of them are about social and environmental and social factors that affect people's health. But about 30 or 40% are about some kind of genetical differences between populations. And in many cases, you cannot guess about what kind of factors, biological, environmental, or epigenetical, or maybe social, cultural, etc., are those articles, because just simple term, racial differences say us nothing, right? And this is such a huge umbrella term for so many different phenomena and so many different processes that occur and that affect people's health, that they become totally meaningless. Yet we need to find some kind of language to talk about those differences, right? Another problem is that many funding institutions actually require to collect, report, and use ethnoracial categories in biomedical research, especially in States. In Europe, it's not, it looks a bit differently because no one's actually requiring to use that kind of information. However, UK made their own guidelines to collect data, ethnoracial data, and sometimes it is used for biomedical research. As I know, most researchers try to align the design of their studies to the requirements of US institutions. This is, for example, because if they are, I don't know, if they try to produce some kind of new drug or something, they wouldn't be able to sell their products in USA without the approval of FDA, which recommends the collection and use of ethnoracial data. So even though in many European countries, we don't have any kind of guidelines for use and collection of ethnoracial information, many researchers use this mainstream race talk that developed in States. The funny thing is that, for example, in UK, the term race is usually replaced with ethnicity. And it was very surprising for me because usually I think about ethnicity in terms of culture, language, and things like that. But in many of those studies, the word ethnicity actually relates to some kind of genetic line. So it's biologized. It's somehow racialized. While in States, race sometimes means very like social construct, but in many biomedical research, it also relates to ancestry. And this is a problem because those guidelines, like the one that are most common, so the OMD, ethnoracial classifications that are used by FDA and NIH in States, they are very unclear when it comes to the definition of race and ethnicity. So while they usually define those terms as social constructs, yet they somehow allow to use them as a description of genetic line or ancestry. So from one hand, they are saying, okay, there are no biological human races, there are just some kind of constructs that we apply to the society. But on the other hand, they are saying, okay, but all the geneticists and so on, they still can use race and ethnicity when they are doing their research. So this is a bit of absurd from my perspective. Those are some quotes from OMD and FDA that illustrate the situation. So for example, OMD is saying the racial and ethnic categories. Oh my God, I cannot see the rest because of some huge window in the middle of my desktop. So you can just read it by yourself. So there is a huge mess when it comes to the use of ethnoracial categories in biomedical research and healthcare, and the whole thing is criticized from many different reasons. First of all, there are a lot of methodological issues when it comes to using those terms, especially in their essentialist and like parabiological meaning. For example, there are arguments, and I'm also one of the person who is actually discussing this problem, that just by adding categories of race, ethnicity, and just by requiring to use that kind of category in research, for example, in subgroup analysis, there is a huge possibility for some kind of biased results. Because the more we look for racial differences, the bigger possibility that we'll find some, even though this is just some kind of misinterpretation of the data, or misinterpretation of the whole situation, or some kind of statistical issue that has no biological meaning. So has no causal relation to the whole research phenomena. And another things are ethical issues. So for example, some kind of researchers are arguing, okay, we may say that, for example, using categories of race and ethnicity is recommended because we need to research, we need to analyze racial inequalities and different, like racial differences in health outcomes, for example, even if we understand those differences in a strictly social or environmental terms. Yet, by simply doing so, we are somehow essentializing and biologizing those terms, because people, even if we will say 1 million times that category of race and ethnicity are just social constructs, when people read that kind of news titles, racial differences in something, they would understand it through the prism of their own experiences, and those experiences are usually very stereotypical, and they are usually essentializing race and ethnicity as some kind of biological natural kinds or something like that. So this is actually a huge problem, and this is there is also an argument that the whole scientific racism, if I could say, is somehow affected by the capitalist need to divide populations, because of course, if we sell products for smaller groups, like we sell more products for specific populations, then we make more profit, as in the case of gender marketing. This is the famous case of B-deal. You probably heard about it. So when there is this product for heart failure called B-deal, and it was a huge case some time ago, that FDA approved so-called first drug for a specific racial group, and it was approved to be a drug for African Americans. Why that happened? Actually, because of some kind of like administrative issues. The company who produced the drug first tried to register a research for few populations, but they got agreement. The FDA agreed to make this research, as I remember, only for in the group of African Americans. So they didn't even had any kind of control group, but the condition of those people who participated in the research improved. So they started to sell the drug as a drug for African Americans. And what was so unethical about that? First of all, there are other drugs with a completely the same chemical ingredients, which are sold for everyone that are not racially profiled. And another thing is that bedyl, because it was profiled for African Americans, its price was higher. So the group that was actually already in a worse situation, like socially, was affected by it even more, because they had to pay more for the drug that could be bought for much lower price if it wasn't named as a product for African Americans. So after the famous history of bedyl, many researchers started to look for racial differences in health, racial differences in reactions to drugs, and racial differences in different health outcomes. But I actually studied like hundreds of articles about so-called racial differences in heart failure and hypotension. And after reading them, I realized that all of those authors are actually talking about so many different factors that affect health. That using just simple term of race and ethnicity, especially without a strict and universal definition of those categories, produce a lot of chaos in scientific communication and produce a lot of social injustice in the end, as in the case of bedyl, for example. So I used some ideas that were already presented by other philosophers, such as Adam Hoffman, for example, Hoffman, who wrote those great papers about racialization. And Adam Hoffman argued that after very thoughtful analysis of different uses of category of race and different arguments for and against the existence of human races, he believes there are no human races, both understood as both social constructs or in terms of biological notions. Adam Hoffman is saying that there are no races, there are just racialized groups, and those concepts, they have different meanings in different contexts, in different populations, in different times. For example, the history of racism is full of situations when people who are now considered as privileged were racialized, and who were white yet racialized by others as some sort of subhumans or something like that. This is actually some scientists are arguing that actually the word slave comes from the word Slavs, who were racialized and sold as slaves on such a huge scale that the term Slav become a substitute or a synonym for slave. So there are those great books, for example, of Ivan Kalmar, who is discussing how Eastern and Central Europeans are still racialized by other populations and still experience racism that can affect their health. So the problem is actually pretty complex, and it's related to many different issues. And what I tried to do is to somehow construct a model that relates to all of those factors that are usually described by the terms racial differences, but to somehow produce a map of those different factors and their interactions. So I propose to apply the concept of racialization to the research about health and to research about healthcare, public health, etc., because I really believe it can be much more precise. And how I understand racialization of an individual, I understand it as some kind of continuous set of different processes operating through several pathways, as well as their complex interactions, because of course those processes are always somehow affecting each other, that by which an individual can be understood by others, as well as understand themselves as a representative of some kind of biologically understood group. So by saying that someone is racialized, I'm saying that someone is perceived as a representative of some kind of race by others and by themselves on many different levels, because of many different things that are happening in their lives through their whole lifespan. I know that at the moment it sounds a bit messy and a bit vague and enigmatic, but I will show you that this proposition, it can be actually pretty clear. So this is the model of processes of racialization of the individual, and the yellow things inside represent the current state of a person's racialization. This state is affected by two major group of factors. One of them are like instrict factors, so some kind of processes that are happening inside of the body of the person, of the individual, yet they are of course affected by the environmental factors. So the factors such as some kind of cultural processes, environmental processes, and by sociocultural processes and environmental processes, I mean very broad categories. Environmental processes are more about material and also symbolic changes in people's environment. Sociocultural processes may be included in this category, of course, but this is just a proposition. I believe that many different kinds of processes or levels of processes could be distinguished in this model. So for example, I could distinguish, and I was thinking about distinguishing institutional processes as the different category, but then I thought that it could be even too complex or too complicated. So we have a history of person's development, which is affected from the one side, which is founded on the process of evolution of mankind. And this history of a person's development is co-shaped by history of environmental and social development that affects people on the many different through many different pathways, like epigenetical, phenotypical, and neuronal. And all of those processes are somehow producing the state of a person's racialization. But what is the most important here? The state is not homogeneous itself. It can be the state of person's racialization can be different on those different levels. So, for example, a person who is environmentally racialized as a representative of, I don't know, African Americans can be racialized as a representative of some other group on a different level. How does it work? I know it may sound very weird, but maybe I will start by explaining what are those processes and what I understand by saying, for example, phylogenetic processes of racialization. And does this mean that there are some kind of biologically understood racialized groups? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that there are some kind of processes that affected people, of course, that produce the great diversity in human genetic pool, and that this diversity become a foundation for the development of the concept of category of race. So this is why people understand and recognize others as representatives of other races. So this is actually pretty simple. Because of many different phylogenetic processes, the concept of races, which is socially constructed, emerged because it is easy to divide people basing on their appearance, but it doesn't mean that there are some kind of groups that are races, of course. Yet I'm not saying that people don't differ between each other. As I know, there are many researchers that argue that the concept of race is simply totally unclear when it comes to its use in genetics and genomics, because it's misleading, because if it's used according to requirements of those funding institutions such as FDA and NIH, about which I was talking at the beginning of my lecture. Usually those finding institutions, they require to collect ethnoracial data that is people's self-identifications. So they are collecting people's affiliations, racial affiliations, right? But those racial identities, they can change, and our genetics, of course, from the perspective of epigenetics, it can change, but generally our genetic code cannot change that much as our racial identities. But I will go back to this problem later. So there are some kind of phylogenetic processes that produced a huge genetic differences between populations, but those differences shouldn't be researched with the concept of race and ethnicity, because those concepts just cannot apply to those, they just don't fit to those differences. And there are different concepts that sounds more appropriate in this context. For example, demographic populations. So demographic populations are just populations that live in a certain area and are not discussed in terms of race. But it may be to, maybe I will just move on. The only thing I wanted to add in the terms of phylogenetic processes of racialization is that this huge diversity between populations that is usually interpreted in terms of race and ethnicity started to produce even more pseudoscientifical concepts that somehow strengthen the scientific racism and the whole pseudoscientific tendencies in biomedical research. And one of that kind of concepts is so-called slavery hypotension hypothesis. So this is this hypothesis that people who are African Americans have higher risks of hypertension and heart failure than whites in US because of some kind of adaptation of those people while they were transported from Africa to US, because they were transported on ships and they had very low access to water and things like that. So the bodies of those who adapted to those conditions survived. But now in the US, when they have the huge access to salt and food and etc., it's problematic. So this is like explanations. The very easy explanation why there is such a huge racial difference between whites and blacks when it comes to hypertension in US. But this is a huge bullshit. Actually, there are I don't know even one reliable research about that support this hypothesis at the moment. Yet some researchers are still using it or trying to find some kind of racial genetic differences that that affects people's health. And after the success of BDIL, this idea of slavery hypotension hypothesis found a lot of new fans who tried to find those differences and of course find drugs for those differences, and BDIL was somehow one of them, right? But if you look closer, as I said before, if you look closer to all of those research about the differences in the risk in hypotension between African Americans and white Americans in states, everything those researchers, those experiments, that kind of analysis, they are rather saying that there is a huge environmental problem that causes those differences, and for sure genetics has very little to do that. I'm sorry, my English is very bad sometimes. So another kind of processes of racializations are epigenetic processes. And while genetics itself is not that important when it comes to research on so-called racial differences in health, epigenetic processes may actually play a very important role here. And that kind experiences of people who live through years of discrimination and who experienced cultural, environmental, and other kinds of racialization are actually exposed to stress and to other kinds of factors that can affect their genetic expression and can in fact affect their health. And there is a lot of research that some kind of trauma can be passed through generations and can affect the health of individuals even like long time after the specific experience happened. And that kind of epigenetic line can transmit some kind of health issues that can also affect how people are racialized in the end. And one of examples is the fact that people who experience trauma, they can, through epigenetical processes, they can somehow pass the tendency to obesity to their children. And this is interesting because obesity itself is sometimes recognized as a characteristic of groups that are racialized. And people who have a higher weight have all set of problems that even that affect their situation even more. So if you are a representative of a group that is racialized, and if your body mass index is very high, then, for example, it is very difficult to find a job, because with the higher body mass index, all other stereotypes that usually go with racial stereotypes, for example, that Latina people or African American people are obese because they are lazy and because they are stupid and because they don't want to work and so on. It actually affects your situation, your economical situation. It is also very stressful for those who experience that kind of stereotypization and extrapolated racialization, I would say. And this is actually like strengthened the whole racial stereotypes that function in our society. So as you see, the pathway of epigenetical racialization can be very subtle, like it can be very delicate. It's not that straightforward that, okay, you experienced, your grandfather experienced racism, so I don't know, you will have some kind of very evident health issues related to racism. But there are many different processes, epigenetical processes that can actually, from one hand, affect people's health, but from the other hand, affect how they are racialized. So in this case, when it comes to the example that I was talking about, it can be a matter of high body mass index, as I said, that usually goes in line with other racial stereotypes. And I know it can be controversial to talk about it in such a straightforward way, but we have those stereotypes. We are all racializing, I don't know, Italians. There was this great cover and discussion about cover of, I don't know, it was the Times or the Guardian or whatever, about Italians and that all Italians eat pasta and things like that. This is also some kind of racialization and stereotypization, right? We have those ideas, those images in our heads that represent those groups, and they are usually also somehow connected with the images of their bodies and images of how they are actually behaving, what they are eating, and what they are doing with their life. And this is what gives a lot of what actually is a basis for other kinds of racial discrimination. And this is the epigenetic processes are also connected with phenotypic processes of racialization. As a phenotypic processes of racialization, I understand all the processes that affect the state of people's body. But while epigenetic processes are strictly, epigenetical, of course, this is pretty obvious, the phenotypic processes of racialization are a broader term because they also cover the so-called wear and tear hypothesis. So the fact that our body wears while we are, working. So people who experience very heavy workload, don't have enough time to rest, have a poor diet, live in pretty bad conditions, of course, will have a body with a in a worse condition as well. And here, those stereotypes also can be strengthened. So I was talking about obesity, and obesity is another is the great example of that problem again. And I already said that there is a huge problem on the labor market for obese people to find good jobs, better paid jobs actually, to not be stigmatized as lazy and sloppy, and to not experience some kind of social exclusion because of how their body looks. But it's not only about obesity. The body which is affected by heavy physical work is not that pretty, right? Usually it's not that perfect, and it's another way of it's another pathway through which the whole stigma, the whole exclusion, and the whole discrimination can affect people's state, and can affect how they are racialized. And this is actually if you played with those AI applications that produce images, right? You probably saw how those applications produce images of Eastern Europeans, for example. They have those red noses, they are very obese, or they are very skinny because of their poor diet, of course. They have those bodies that are not that pretty. And this is how actually people are imagining Eastern Europeans, right? So this is an example of how racial stereotypes about the state of our body, the image of our body, strengthen the racial prejudice against some populations. Neuronal processes of racialization are those processes that actually are affected by everything what's happening in the environment of the individual, and that are responsible for how the individual racialize themselves, so how they actually feel about themselves, how they recognize themselves, about a representative of which group, but also they are responsible for how we understand and recognize others. So here we can talk about many different kind of mechanisms. For example, mechanisms that influence intergroup and other group behaviors and prejudice, like so-called other race effect, and different in-group biases in empathizing with representatives of other groups. all the tendencies to dehumanize and homogenize representatives of other social groups, etc. And I don't only talk about races here, but also about different social groups, such as, I don't know, different people who have different occupations or who talk in different language, especially people who talk with different accents can be racialized through those processes. And experience racism and xenophobia because of their accent, because they are recognized as representatives of other group. So through neuronal processes, all the social stereotypes, all the racial stereotypes are actually embodied in our brains, right? And they actually reproduce those biases. And this is a huge problem because we all embody racial stereotypes, and we all embody some kind of very stereotypical and unfair and misleading beliefs about others. And it's important to know that. It's also important to know that because our brains and our minds are pretty plastic, we can affect how we treat those people and how we respond to their otherness. Especially, we can modulate this with proper education, and it's particularly important when it comes to health practitioners and medical doctors who can easily racialize their patients. And there are huge studies that people who feel racialized by their doctors don't trust in the treatment that much, don't follow instructions that much, usually don't want to go back to the hospital or don't want to go back to the doctor because they don't want to experience it again. There is also this problem that if people are diagnosed by someone who is biased, then their diagnosis can be just misleading, as in an example with my mother, right? That I told you about before, and it could happen to all of you actually. Like, I was in Great Britain when I was much younger, and I was a PhD student then. I had some kind of medical issues, and I went to the doctor there. And just because it was Poland just was included in European Union then, and I was one of the first Poles that came to that particular region to work. The doctor immediately prescribed me some drugs for sexually transmitted disease because they were sure I'm a sex worker because I came to UK to work, right? While it was totally something else. It was some kind of bladder issues, nothing connected with the sex work. But as an Eastern European with an Eastern European accent and everything, I was misdiagnosed and stereotypized as a sex worker just because that was the typical stereotype about Polish women working in UK at that time. So it can be actually pretty important issue when it comes to healthcare and how people are understanding others, how they are actually trying to understand their condition, but it's also affecting researchers, right? We, as researchers, we all have a set of beliefs, more or less conscious, that affect our cognitive processes and that affect our inferences, right? So we should pay much more attention to those neuronal processes of racialization, because from one side, they can affect how researchers are designing their research, how they are interpreting the outcomes of the research, how they are, I don't know, designing AI algorithms that interpret data, or how they divide that data to be interpreted by AI, or how they diagnose or what they would prescribe to people. But from the other hand, they also affect how people feel and how they understand their place in society. So if people experience a lot of racial discrimination, if they experience a lot of stress, of course their state will get worse. For example, there are some studies showing that people who are Black in states experience much more stress and anxiety when they see policemen. Whites, they wouldn't feel that stress, and the stress, of course, affects people's body, right? And their physical and emotional condition. So if someone learned through their life that a policeman may be dangerous, they won't feel relaxed in their presence. Usually people who are privileged in US don't have that kind of problem. But if it would be me as Eastern European, I would probably also feel stressed in that kind of situation. So it's actually pretty, again, it's actually pretty complex. Environmental processes of racialization are another category that can be analyzed through many different angles. First of them is, for example, the architecture of our environment, which is designed to exclude. There are the whole neighborhoods in states that are designed to keep their people who are living there separated from others. For example, because there are not enough bridges that connect those areas with more expensive ones and more prestigious ones. There are not enough communication, like buses that go from one area to another. And as I know, that was designed on purpose, because some privileged populations or privileged communities didn't want to face with those less privileged in their neighborhood. That kind of areas usually have worse access to education and worse access to healthcare, and this is a very serious problem. But there are also other ways in which environmental processes may affect people's health and may also affect their state of racialization. For example, the change of their environment can affect their self-identification. People who migrate may change their racial identity. I know it sounds a bit weird, but it really happens. Similarly, as changing their social status can affect their racial identity. For example, people who somehow improved their social status. So, for example, they somehow became richer, usually feel more whiter at the same time, even though they still look the same. And moreover, people like some groups of people are negotiating their racial identification. So in the history, we had many examples when some kind of groups change their status to be more white. Like, I don't know, this is more about social racialization, of course, but I will just tell about this example, like people from Ireland in States, they were at the beginning of so some like slavery farms in Virginia, their status was actually the same or very similar to blacks there. And then they negotiated to become more white, yet they were still recognized as less white than America-born whites. So what is very interesting, in 19th century, Irish women participated in some biomedical research, gynecological research that was run without any anesthesia, and usually was repeated in many times, because similarly as Black women were perceived as more immune to pain. So as you see, the perception of who is a representative of what group and what race can change a lot, especially if people are migrating, as I said. And of course, changes of environment are a huge factor when it comes to people's migration, right? This is, when it comes to biomedical research, this is a huge problem, because we are dealing with racialization of new groups and in new places just because they were forced to migration. Of course, not only by the change of environment and climate crisis and things like that, but also because they had to, because of wars, etc. Like in Europe, there is this huge humanitarian crisis in Polish border, where some people are passed through border because they are more white. And here I'm talking about Ukrainians, why they are also racialized in Poland as this worst group. But at the same time, there is a huge community of people who are excluded from getting into Poland and who are from Syria or Senegal, or who are just from other communities, and they're like their status in my country is completely different. They also have totally different access to healthcare. They have totally different access to social care, and there are experiences completely different reactions from people. And finally, environmental processes can affect how people are racialized also, because some parts of the world are, due to racist capitalism, are experiencing repeated exploitation. They experience much more pollution. Their state of health is much worse than those who are residents of much richer countries. And it happens also in more smaller communities. For example, when it comes to Native Americans in states, many places in which their lives are close to some kind of places in which toxic pollutions are collected, and this is what can affect their health. However, this is important to remember that if we are focused on that kind of factors, then the political identity of those people is not that important. It is important where they live. So, for example, if researchers are trying to study how toxins affect health of people who live in reservations, then it's not a good idea to use their racial self-affiliations that are collected by FDA or, oh my God, by OMD and things like that, because that information tells us nothing about where they actually live, because many people who self-identify as Native Americans, they don't live in reservations, they just live in cities, and their environment is totally different. So what I'm trying to say is that each of those levels have different kind of features that affect it and should be research with the use of different reference classes, different subgroups, different categories. And finally, sociocultural processes. I'm not going to talk much longer, just 5 more minutes probably at top. So of course, sociocultural processes is another huge group that could be divided into many different others. Which is the group of all of those processes through which racial categories are actually produced. So what is important here is that each community, each population, each country have different understanding of ethnoracial categories. And this is a problem in biomedical research because first, it enables constructive scientific communication, but also sometimes it makes impossible to understand some kind of phenomena that actually affect people's health if we apply understanding of ethnoracial classifications from US to Europe, then we won't understand what's happening on the Polish border with Ukrainians and with people from other nations that are coming here. If we apply those categories, then we won't understand why I was understood as I was recognized as a sex worker in UK, right? Because if we apply those categories to Europe, then I'm just a white privileged person. But this is not the whole story, right? If we apply UK ethnoracial classifications to those studies, then we end up with their perspective, which was constructed in regards to their history of colonization. So those categories are not universal, yet many researchers treat them as if they are universal and objective. And this is another problem because this is giving a lot of fuel to essentialize those categories again. If there are some kind of objective social categories that divide people, then maybe there is some kind of biological reason for that, right? But we know that there is none. And as I said before, people are changing their racial identities. They are changing we are changing the understanding of race and ethnicity all the time. So what I propose that first of all, we need to identify what kind of factors we are actually researching, on what kind of level of racialization. If researchers are focusing on environmental changes or factors, if they are trying to understand some kind of neuronal mechanism or psychological mechanisms that affect people's health, or if they are trying to understand some kind of epigenetical mechanisms, what they are actually researching. If we name all of those processes as racial differences, we know nothing about their source, we know nothing about how they interact with other processes of racialization, and we cannot construct design our research appropriately, because all of those levels, they sometimes require constructing different subgroups, like naming different subgroups and recognizing different subgroups. People who are racialized environmentally, they are not, as I said before, they should be the criteria of their identification should be different than those who experience racism, or those who have a long history of being discriminated and things like that, right? So on some levels, self-identity could work. On others, social status or levels of education or other measures of disadvantage should be used, and not category of race and ethnicity, especially that there are people who are who identify themselves as Blacks and as Native Americans and etc., but actually have much better social status than some whites who are not white enough, as Ivan Kalmar would say. So we need to pay much more attention to what we are actually studying, on what level of racialization, and what kind of language we should use to construct reference classes or subgroups that we are investigating. And this is something that I would really like to discuss with all of you, especially in regards to intersectionally fair algorithms, because I've learned from John that some of you are interested in the subject. So please, I would like to find out more about your perspective on what I just said. If you actually feel that my proposal may be useful or maybe not, I'm just open to discussion at the moment. And thank you very much for listening to my chaotic and very poor talk.
I completely disagree with you. I don't think it was poor at all. I've quite thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think that the the model that you have sort of proposed for understanding racialization, I think gives us a lot more of that capability of being nuanced, capability of drawing finer differences that can really improve the way that we perform scientific research. I'm going to take advantage of hitting the unmute button first to ask a question. In my mind, I can really sort of think of two very distinct ways in which we as scientists are interested in information regarding race and racialization. The first is one that you showed a lot of during the presentation, and that is to understand or analyze a fairly specific difference. And I think you've done a lot in sort of showing us that we do have a language and a mechanism for making these differences clearer and more specific. But the other reason why I think we may want to include racial and racialization information is to ensure that when we're doing a study that is designed or construed broadly, that there is a certain level of representativeness.
Yeah.
And to me, this is where I think there may be an issue between having this model that very well defines and creates differences that may not necessarily mesh perfectly with the idea of creating not a reference class for a particular racial group or two reference classes for either side of a racialized divide, but creating a reference group that represents an entire post-national, multiracial, multicultural population, or possibly even all humans.
So I think actually it could be done. Like we are collecting different kinds of data anyway, right? Racial or ethnic self-identification is one of them. Others are, as I said, like socioeconomic status, for example. And of course, we are not gonna rid of race talk from our language, because people have those identities already, right? I'm not gonna say you cannot feel Black, or you cannot feel white, or you cannot feel, I don't know, Latina or whatever. It would be stupid, totally stupid. But so of course, yeah, we have those. We have this strong intuition that we want to include representatives of different populations in our studies, and I agree with that. And I also agree that racial or ethnoracial self-identification can be one of those reference classes or subgroups, but we need to know what that information gives us. It gives us almost nothing if we want to proceed with some kind of genetic study. But it gives us something if it goes, if we get it together with other informations like education level and socioeconomic status about people's living conditions or level of disadvantage and things like that. So it's not that we shouldn't collect that data, but we need to know what is our goal and why we want to use them. In many biomedical research, this is not done correctly. I'm not sure if it's an answer to your question, but I think we are already collecting so many information that if we understand those mechanisms that I was talking about, and if we can recognize what factor actually is responsible for which of those levels, and how we can label it, like if it's neighborhood, is it the level of education, is it self-identification? Is it something totally different? Because, for example, if we are doing psychological studies, self-identification would be very important, right? Is it a specific gene that someone has? We can without huge problems actually run that kind of studies. And yeah.
So it's really just it's on us to be more specific with what we're researching, even when we do these sort of broader or broadly strewn population-based studies. Yeah,
especially, for example, in genetics, like those are those voices that I already talked about, that the categories should represent demographic categories and not races. And it actually, the great illustration for that is the new proposal of FDA, I suppose, that is on their side for the new forms. I just saw it a few days ago, and they had this proposition to collect more specific ethnoracial data. And the proposition contains the form for people who are white, and there is this funny field when you can put specify what kind of Europe or what kind of white person you are. And you can specify Pole, or I don't know, Hungarian or Irish or whatever. But then people who are Black also live in Poland, and people who are Asian also live in Poland, right? So yeah, we should be much more specific, because at the moment it's our understanding of what is race and what is racism as well, because usually we understand, our understanding of racism is very racist, and it's very colonial, and it's actually a representation of the mainstream US race talk, right? That doesn't recognize groups that were racialized through history. For example, as I said, some populations in Europe. So yeah, it should be much more specific and open to criticism and much more aware.
Thank you. For anyone else, if you have any questions, just, oh, yes, Islam?
Thank you very much, Joanna, for this enlightening talk. Like, there's a lot to digest for me, at least. But I would like maybe to make a comment on the, there's a nice definition that you included from Hockman 2017, that slide. Yeah, so that was a very informative. I think it gives us like, it gave me at least like a better understanding of what you mean by, you know, race, and like these different compounders that can influence the definition of race. So there's one thing, like each of these components, I was looking at them and they could be used to discriminate. Like somebody knows where you're originally from, or they know your, for example, I don't know, your language, your culture, your religion, your gender. They can use this in a negative way. And, you know, doctors can do that, practitioners can do that, human beings can do that, and algorithms can do that too, right? Because we code them up, they carry out biases. However, the way I think we should use this additional information is not to discriminate, but to design personalized and compassionate, I would say, solutions. Right, like or treatments. So if I get access to that information, I should not use it against you as a bias, but I should use it for your well-being, right? So, and this is where I think the real kind of, you know, the real problem lies, like how people take this information and are educated to use these confounders, these factors to better you know, like to design better medicine, to improve our quality of life, our healthcare, our well-being. And I think, like, you know, like in terms of algorithms and fairness, it's a huge topic, and collecting such data is very difficult. So as you as you mentioned earlier, it depends on the context. It depends on the study. We can cover all these factors or interactants. However, I think the more we collect, the better. But collecting all of this information. So let's say, for example, if I am a patient and the doctor would like to access, all of these, everything, like, biological information, administrative, cultural, economic, geography, lingual, my religious beliefs, every single thing, past traumas, history. So just to administer a particular treatment, it may be very overwhelming for the patient. And it might, so, there's also privacy. So privacy, do I want the other person to learn and to know about all these things? Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe partially. So that's another thing. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can comment on what's your take on on privacy, right? So when we do these studies, or when you go to a doctor, right, or when you are a student applying for a master, I don't know, or for a job, right? When you're moving to a different country, you're applying for a visa. Which of these kind of factors would I want to reveal about myself? And so in revealing that, would that be used against me or for me, right? So what are your thoughts on this point?
This is a really difficult question.
I know. Tell me about it.
First of all, I agree that we cannot collect every information about everyone, and we need some proxies, we need some categories that could be used as tools, as some kind of tools for grouping populations, right? And I agree that it may be impossible to be very precise with everything when it comes to each individual, because then we end up with precision medicine, and it's not our goal here, right? Yet I believe that the more we know about factors that are crucial and relevant in certain situations, the easier would be for us to recognize what questions should we ask to our patients if we have if we are dealing with a person who looks like living through huge anxiety and stress. Then we don't need to ask about their visa. We just need to ask if they are actually experiencing stress, right? If we, however, have a person with a huge rash on their skin, then maybe we should ask about environment rather than, I don't know, some kind of experiences or ethnoracial self-identification. But then if the matter is somehow connected with diet, then maybe ethnoracial identification may be important, right? So it's always a matter of what we are of our goals, what we are trying to achieve. We really don't need everyone to answer to all of those questions. Of course, it's always a risk, right? We need to assess this risk, what we are asking and what we are ignoring. We may ignore something important here, but diagnosis is always balancing, right? Risks.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on the terminology. Yeah. Well, do you think we need to re-educate our, we re-educate the, physicians and GPs and doctors, do we need to kind of revise the way we teach medicine based on this globally?
Yeah, I think so. I don't want to say I would like to educate everyone now and please listen to me, I'm the wise one and you are all stupid and you should change. It's not like that. I think, however, people should be much more aware when they are using ethnoracial categories, especially in medicine. I know that there is this huge tendency to talk much more about racial differences in medicine now. So, for example, even in those TV shows like, I don't know, Chicago Med or Grey's Anatomy, there are those discussions that Black patients should get different diagnoses because of some kind of, I don't know, correction algorithms, or that correction algorithms, like racial correction algorithms, are unfair, and that then they can actually bias our understanding of the situation, and that, for example, Black patients that need a transplantation, some kind of transplant, cannot get it because of those algorithms, because some of his or her statistics don't fit into the needed profiles because of correction algorithms, right? So yeah, I think there is a huge discussion about it. However, it is again very stereotypical, because it's this discussion is, how to say it in English, like it's people are discussing those problems using those essentialist conception of race and ethnicity, and this mainstream race talk that is not getting us to the place in which I wish we were, like with a more understanding of those phenomena and all of those processes and their diversity.
I'm wondering to how much our capability of integrating and including this sort of information is contingent on already having a relatively good mechanistic understanding of the disease process itself. So if we're imagining, say, hypertension, we already have an idea of things like there are environmental and behavioral factors that affect hypertension. Yeah. So if you have someone, and dietary factors. So if you have someone who's, staying on the couch all day and eating a high salt diet, they're more likely to have hypertension. Yeah. And we understand that. And thus we can take that information into account. And importantly, we can use that information to sort of almost purify our samples in order for getting other information, such as, say, genetic information. Yeah. That way you could find, a genetically diverse group of people who all have the same environment, same behaviors, et cetera. And that way really distill out that genetic component. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, for certain diseases, and potentially many diseases, we may not have that degree of understanding. Yeah. So, for example, if we're taking something like Alzheimer's disease, and we were pretty sure it's that it's caused by tau proteins, but we don't necessarily know if this is an environmental factor, is this a genetic factor? There's lots of different components, and that makes it a lot harder to, quote unquote, purify our sample for any individual component. Yeah. Another example that I'm looking into sort of right now is the physiological, well, I'm hoping to look at the physiological effect on the brain of things like drug addiction. Mm-hmm. And one of the big problems that we're having is being able to disentangle these different factors, and actually being able to disentangle cause and effect almost.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you have any sort of opinions on how we could, other than the collecting of more data, if there's any other way we, more sort of specific data, if there's any way that we could use this sort of model and this sort of framework for improving our capability of doing medical research into those less well understood diseases or conditions.
So I didn't think about it, to be honest. The one thing that comes to my mind is that this model actually works. I believe it works for all the situations when the factor, when we are dealing with some kind of discrimination. It doesn't need to be racialization. It may be homophobia, for example, and things like that. It would probably go with them, like, it could be probably very similar situation. Yet, this is the only thing that comes to my mind at the moment, and this is not actually an answer to your question. Probably when we don't know mechanisms, then of course, like we cannot tell a priori what level of phenomena we are, we will finally recognize as significant in certain situation. But every researcher is like doing their research. They are always focusing on some kind of, I don't know, angle through which they are analyzing it, right? So they should probably just focus on this angle and focus on what kind of factors and interactions are important in this particular context. And maybe, this won't give them anything, but this is how it's done, right? Like, even if they don't have any hypothesis from the start, then they are not, like, we don't analyze everything generally. We always focus on something. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
I think I've written some stuff down to try and digest later.
Yeah, it's hard. It's difficult to answer to that question because I cannot help with all the problems in science and in medicine with a very simple model here. It's just impossible. Yeah, sadly.
Darn it! I wish if you could, that would be awesome. Whenever we have a scientific question, we could just come to you and have the answers.
Yeah, but yeah, it's not gonna happen. And probably even this is like, it still needs to be developed, and it can work in some situations, but in others it still needs a lot of work to be done on this subject to to improve it. So yeah, this is just a proposal, and I think it's just a starting point to make those discussions how we could actually replace the concept of race and ethnicity with concept of racialization in biomedical research, because this is a long way to go with this goal, I suppose. And going back to AI, I'm sorry, I just closed it. You were talking about fair algorithms, right? So I just recently read a lot of text about it and about AI fairness and things like that. And I think here this proposal could work very nicely, because usually when AI fairness is discussed, even if it's discussed in a very intersectional perspective, then those categories, race and ethnicity, are again used in a very essentialist and universalist way, as like someone has this race and ethnicity and that's it. But it's not happening like that, right? And it's just not a matter of statistics to make equal chances for false positives for people of this race and false negatives of people for that race and things like that. It's much more complicated, and probably the concept of racialization could be used to improve those algorithms, and like not algorithms themselves, but how the subgroups are constructed to make those algorithms more fair.
That is interesting. It would be, I'm sort of imagining in a sort of perfect AI fairness research world, the ability to sort of ask the algorithm, okay, can you identify different groups that you yourself are treating differently, and what defines these, what defines these groups, and what defines how you're treating these groups differently, and then from that sort of extract information about how racialization is affecting that particular algorithm and that particular decision. So instead of giving an algorithm information, instead of just giving an algorithm information, say about the self-reported race of the person, and having it sort of make sure that it's balancing the accuracies between them, have it say something like, okay, here's the model that I thought of, and note that if this person has this sort of dietary preference, they're treated this way. And you can be like, oh, okay, now what is the relationship between that dietary preference and these concepts of self-reported race, just to sort of dig into what aspects of racialization does that algorithm itself spontaneously find important for that particular problem. Yeah, this is one thing. And another is like when we feed algorithms with data, and when they look for some patterns and they recognize some racial differences, we need to ask the question what they are actually recognizing, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, because this is also very huge mess at the moment, and because we are applying those categories usually automatically, right? Race and ethnicity. We don't know what those patterns means, why they actually appeared, and to what they relate to. Yeah, it seems to me that the idea of fairness in AI is really inextricably linked to the idea of the interpretability of AI. Yeah. That the only sort of way we can really tell if something is fair for some reasonable definition of fairness is to have an idea of what the AI itself is thinking, and then use our a priori sort of ideas of what is fair, and to make sure that that algorithm aligns to those a priori ideas. Yeah. This is a lot of work to be done. Sorry. I will just check one thing. Okay. So do you have like any more questions?
if there's anyone in the audience who has a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand.
There's something on the chat, or
I'm just going to check. It does not look like we have a specific question in the chat. No.
I just didn't saw the chat before. Okay. Yeah.
I think maybe we should end with something sort of nice and lighthearted.
Yeah.
I'm bad at being nice and lighthearted. In your sort of, if you could make a perfect artificial intelligence algorithm that could do absolutely anything and do it perfectly, what would you do?
Oh my God, I don't know. Like generally?
Yeah, just generally.
Oh my God. I would try to create some kind of perfect redistribution of wealth, and I don't know. It's a huge question, like question to a god or something. I have no idea. Yeah, I would think probably about some kind of like redistribution of benefits and problems across the human population, and try to find some answers how to protect our earth and environment and everything. But this is so like, disconnected with our talk today.
Oh, well, I don't think it's entirely disconnected. There's environmental benefits there. There's sociological there. It certainly would make research a lot easier if everyone was had the same sort of environmental and demographic sort of baseline. Then we could biologize everything, because everything that's not biological would be equal.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if I understand everything at the moment. I think we went too far probably. And
well,
it may be also because it's already 7 in Poland.
True, same here in France.
Oh yeah, because you're in France.
So
yeah, I hope we someday could talk more about interpretation of medical images and those racial differences in those images. Mm-hmm. Because I'm still going back to those this problem, like how to actually prepare fair big data subgroups, and how to select data for algorithms and AI generally, and to make it less biased, but at the same to not like, not, how to say it in English, like you have censura, like you forbid some data to be proceeded or to be used.
You sort of say that certain patterns are not allowed to be used. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Because at the moment, people are saying we should actually, make our research more inclusive to diverse populations. But how to, in the end, how to name those populations and how to design those classifications and how to label those subgroups to make it actually unbiased and actually more fair. if you understand me.
Yeah, exactly. To take into account those sort of racialized differences that actually do have an effect on the problem.
Yeah.
So making algorithms care, or I guess if to use something like a catchphrase, to make those algorithms think of race as something that's more than just skin deep.
Yeah, and to make it like more fair from the methodological point of view, epistemic and ethical point of view, but to make it also to be a reliable science and not only political correctness, right? Because it's not my goal to to remove some kind of discussions from science, just to make them more precise and to make them more scientifical in the end. Because I truly believe that my proposal is not I never wanted to argue for it from strictly ethical point of view. I always wanted to show that, okay, this is methodological. There are methodological arguments to do that, and not only political ones. Because many people, when I started to talk about, okay, I would like to actually replace terms race and ethnicity in science with racialization, they are usually I have this feedback like, okay, oh my God, another lefty is saying us that we cannot talk about race and things like that. Like in Poland, there are those discussions. Oh my God, this is another no-Marxist scientist that is telling us how to live and think. But no, I think that reliable science and precise science could actually be more reliable and more precise if we do that work.
Yeah, this is a call for being more specific. This is a call for being clear.
Let us be more specific.
Yeah, I don't interpret it as saying, oh, we shouldn't talk about certain things. In fact, I see it as quite the opposite. It's saying we should talk more about what these things actually mean in and in the context and why the context matters.
Yeah, oh my God. Thank you.
But thank you for doing this journal club. I know I've certainly got a lot out of it, even though it has just made some aspects of my research life a little bit more difficult, but a lot more rigorous.
Yeah, this is what philosophy of science do. Like, we are all crazy about concepts and categories and definitions. So I hope I will be able to help maybe someday, and maybe we could think about some solutions to the problems I just added to your work.
I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah. Then once again, thank you for having me, and probably I will just say goodbye for now, and hopefully I will see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.